Well, I'm a man and I've talked about feminism. I'm also white and I've talked about racism. So I guess it's high time that I, as a heterosexual, talk about queerness. So buckle up as I exercise all my privileges. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we're talking about one book. Not only one book, but the first 2023 release that I actually read and loved. It's definitely one of my most anticipated reads of the year, and it is Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. And we'll do the usual thing, which is I'll give you a quick synopsis why you should definitely go and read the book, and then I'll have a bit of a beer and we'll talk about all the things that I think make this book so fantastic, which is, you know, the more spoilery part of the whole conversation that we'll have. But before we do that, welcome if you're new, welcome back if you're old. Thanks for watching. I always appreciate it. Please like, subscribe, comment, share, do all those wonderful things. And if you feel like helping me out, there's a bunch of links down there. Right now, I really do need some help. Anyway, that's all the formal stuff. Let's get into it and talk about Camp Damascus. All right. Now, Camp Damascus is the first full-length novel by Chuck Tingle, whom people in the more queer spheres probably know as a writer of a lot of very interesting stories about dinosaurs and other, well, anthropomorphic figures having erotic encounters. It's brilliant stuff. I can highly recommend you go and read some. It's queer activism and fun stories, and it's just very positive and cool. But finally, Chuck Tingle sat down and wrote an entire novel, and it's a horror novel. And when I found out about that, like last year at some point, I was like, wow, I want to read this as soon as it comes out. And so I did. Obviously, this being horror and stuff, I don't want to spoil anything. I will just say, if you're into your 80s teeny slasher movies in a way, if you're into horror in general, but in a more like positive, empowering vibe, sort of, because evil sometimes actually, you know, people stand up towards evil. If that's your vibe, then you really want to read this book. It is, I would say, one of the most important quick reads that you can find right now that encapsulates so much of our current issues, and yeah, go and read it. It's brilliant, it's fun, it's dark, it's scary, but it's also very positive. And it does even have Christian heavy metal in it, which is, you know, is something. Anyway, that's all the good things I can say about it before I actually, you know, go into details. It's a first-person narrative, yeah, that's the final thing I'll say. It's brilliant. Go read it. It's the #1 book you should read this year if you want to understand a lot of like online queer and so forth discourse, and be on the right side of the culture war just for once. All right, go read it. I'll have a bit of beer and then we'll talk about in more detail why I think it does all these wonderful things that I just claimed it does. All right. That was quick. I hope you enjoyed the book. So let's talk about what it does and why I think it does all these things so well. Let's start with the first thing. Horror has always been political. Horror is probably the best genre to look at if you want to figure out what people are currently afraid of. It usually does that. You look at Cold War horror is usually either nuclear stuff with science gone wrong. Something like Godzilla, for example, would be an interesting case there. But there's more of that sort. Then there's other horror that definitely go into the, well, Red Scare, fear of communism kind of horror in there. And there's always been, well, a strong kind of horror that used queerness as a threat, because for a long time, that's how conservative America, which is where a lot of horror was made, did kind of view these things. So, yeah, those are just some elements. I mean, you ever heard about Dracula and vampires being a bit of a symbol for capitalism or feudalism? Yeah, that's exactly that kind of thing. Horror is, well, on the one hand political, but also very much something that explains a lot about like the troubles of people or the things that are on people's minds. And I think in that way, horror has always been a bit of a shorthand to figure these kind of things out. And well, that's just how fiction works, because fiction is where we, as a species, kind of explore the things that we have on our minds at one specific point when we create that fiction. And that's the same with Camp Damascus. Now, as I said, for a long time, there was a lot of queerphobia, homophobia, transphobia, and so forth in horror movies. There's a excellent video on exactly that from Lindsay Ellis and ContraPoints, where they talk about, transphobia in stuff like Psycho, or Silence of the Lambs, and some others of that sort. That's not the only stuff, but it has a long tradition, so I guess it's high time that we find horror, and I'm pretty sure there is some out there that I've just never actually looked at because, I don't read that much horror, and I'm a bit, privileged in a lot of ways. But there's obviously always been horror that it targets, a queer audience because, queer people are probably afraid of a lot of things. And I guess this is the point where I need to say this as a, straight person. I am not qualified to speak too much about that. I will talk about how it has impacted me, what I thought about it, what it made me feel, and so forth. But I'm sure it does ring much more powerfully in all kinds of ways for actual queer people. So I will not take that away. If you're queer and you've read the book, please let me know what you thought about it. I'd love to hear your perspective on it because, as I said, I can only guess. It's, once again, what I call exercising my privilege, which is what I do because I think straight people can learn a lot from this book as well. So, as I said, what with, queerphobia on the one hand, having a long tradition in horror, there should also be horror that addresses the fears that a lot of the queer community does face every day, which is, persecution, marginalization, and, all kinds of fears for their lives. Which does make for really compelling horror, right? So, Camp Damascus tackling this does, feel like something that is needed. And I think that's the next part, which is, while there have always been all kinds of LGBTQIA plus people in the world, we all know that, with recent, changes, I would say largely to the better, these groups have gotten a lot more visibility, and that means that, once you can actually sort of be openly or try to be openly queer, other people will do that as well and try to be open. So there is the fact that this is an audience, or this is I don't want to say large part, but it's a part of society. I think that is another part. It's very much a younger demographic for at this point, or at least the younger demographic has, I feel, the chance or taken the chance to be more openly queer, and I for one really love that. Now, why is that important? Because horror is also and has always been more of a, medium for younger people in a lot of ways. The scary movies, whether you go to like a drive-in movie theater, whether you watch those on VHS in the 80s, and a lot of these have always targeted that. So this being a novel that does deal in the language of a younger form of pop culture in a lot of ways, I think is important as well, because that's its most main target audience, and it's speaking that language in a lot of ways, which you can see when you look at the different pop culture references to different aesthetics, whether it's the heavy metal style or whether it's hip hop or other aspects. And I think it's important to have that because, once again, horror has always been in that way also something that expressed a very specific, aesthetic and zeitgeist in a way. And Come Damascus does do that as well. So that's first things that I think make this book very powerful in that regard. But of course, there's more. Now, we need to come back to the sexuality aspect here. I already said it's sort of built in a lot of ways on your 80s and then continuous like slasher movies in a way, your Halloween's, Friday the 13th, and so forth. And especially something like Scream, where you have a group of usually young people and they get attacked by demons or something like a murderer, whatever you have, and one by one they get killed and so forth. It's very much a trope, and we all know it. There have been movies that make fun of it, for fuck's sake. And you know what? There is an underlying thing, which is usually that Purity gets rewarded in these movies. You look at a lot of these movies and a lot of these stories, it's the slightly awkward girl that survives, the one that is pure, that is not, drinking too much or, God's forfend, having sexual encounters and so forth. Those are the people that get killed early on. And that is a very deliberate message of a lot of these movies. They do in fact propagate a myth, which is that purity is important to keep in these ways, and that dark and dangerous things will happen to people who don't follow that purity law in a lot of ways. Who else does kind of, do the thing? Well, Christianity does so, or a lot of conservatives do so, and they use that to attack, queerness, which is often seen as impure and unholy and so forth. So Camp Damascus going that extra step and having basically the same setup, which is, if you are not straight and, devout and pure in the way that our community, in this case Christian conservatives, prescribe, dark things will happen to you, quite literally, because we'll set demons on you. That is still more or less the same setup. It just goes one layer beyond, which is the good part. Because it makes it very clear that it is a human thing. It's humans that set those demons up. It's humans that make the decision to punish what they conceive as impurity. That's the extra layer that is important. It's sort of taking the setup of a slasher movie in a way, and then adding the extra thing, which is, there's a message here that we're delivering, and, drawing back the curtain behind the people that actually make behind the motives that made those movies, and turning that into the actual horror. And that's I think, is brilliant. Because it allows all the people that are seen as impure, cast out by society. In this case, our three main characters, Rose, our narrator, Rose, Saul, the heavy metal guy, and Willow, Rose's lover, those outcasts, it makes those the heroes. And it makes them not for being, pure and, not part of all the degeneration of the Western society. It makes them exactly those, because they are queer and they're cool in that regard. They are actually on the outside and not just a stand-in for a very, very conservative morality. And I think that's the beauty, because it allows people that feel marginalized in a lot of ways. We'll come back to that in a moment. It allows people to be who are marginalized for their sexuality, their gender identity, their possibly, neurodiversity, disabilities, what have you. People that feel marginalized and not represented by these characters, it makes them the heroes. And it makes them the heroes in a very important way, which is to actually break down that system, burn it all down, take it apart, because it's a system of oppression. And what you do with systems of oppression is you burn them down. And that, I think, is once again is a very powerful message. I mean, the point here is that it is a message that, activists are preaching all the time. But it's a very different thing if you couch that in the language of the horror movie, in the language of the horror genre, when you couch it in the idea of, demons actually, hunt you for your, because they're evil, and then you stand up against it. You stand up against the system. You stand up against, humans that do this for no other reason because they personally believe it's what they should do. Which brings us to the next part that I wanted to highlight about this book, which I really, really appreciated. And that is, for something as blunt as a horror story, as a teenage horror story, which it is, it has a lot of very interesting nuance that I personally really, really appreciated. Because while it is about a Christian conversion camp, it is also very much clear that this is one specific interpretation of Christianity. It's very easy to just go against all kinds of religion, be an angry atheist and so forth. I will not take that away from you if you want to do that. But it does manage to actually highlight the good aspects that religious community or faith can actually, bring people. And one of the wonderful, really beautiful scenes here is when Rose when Rose and Saul go to church for their before they actually do the thing and kill their two demons. When they just sit outside, because it's at the end of the day, it's that community that is important. The idea of, having a positive community that does not work through just excluding. I think that's a very interesting aspect of the book, because it could have been so easy to just go, well, Christians evil and they set demons on queer people. You could have done that. Well, Chuck Tingle could have done that, but that would have taken away from the message, because at the end of the day, it's one specific aspect that is not tied to the actual faith. It's tied to how people interpret and twist certain stories. Now that is one aspect that I found really interesting. There's more elements there. For example, the quick interaction between Rose and her mother are very interesting in that regard as well, when it is clear that while Rose is actually queer, we don't know about Rose's mother, but it's very clear that she also has submitted to that system of oppression and would have probably liked a very different, life. We see that with her love for that house that is outside of the community, so people can't always spy on her, so forth. We see that in the situation when she actually helps Rose to escape, and I found it, heartbreaking in a lot of ways, and heartrending in a lot of ways, how, on the one hand, Lisa, Rose's mother, does perpetuate these systems of oppression, the way she, teaches her daughter how to mete out biblical punishments for all kinds of things. That game is that's scary as hell. It's absolutely frightening, because, it's something that some people do when they feel they have religious righteousness on their side, or any other form of righteousness on their side. And on the other hand, we know that there's a lot of regret there when she lashes out against Rose when Rose leaves and goes like, you are so spoiled. Because, yes, probably the mother isn't really happy in that system of oppression either, but she has given up. She has given up, and by giving up, submitted to that system. And I think the way it is portrayed allows us to feel for the mother as well, to, hope that people that are still in that system may at some point find the strength to break out of it and let, their love and their empathy and their compassion actually dictate their lives, and not some external rules. But it's very difficult, because once you give up something, that's part of how, systems of oppression are perpetuated. It's like, if I suffered, why should, the next generation have it any better? And the answer is, of course, why the fuck not? But it's very difficult to do that, because we have this innate weird thing. I don't want to call it jealousy, but there's this weird thing going on with all of us humans, that we like to perpetuate the misery that we suffered in order for it to probably feel more justified, because it allows us to kind of pretend it's part of human nature or human life, even though it really doesn't have to. And I just really appreciate the way that is handled in this book, because it does give us that aspect as well. So there's all of these aspects. Let's look at the final really important part, and that is the part where I'm really not good, probably not qualified to talk too much about, but I wanted to mention it, and that is, on the one hand, there is the idea, and I think the metaphor that is worked out here, with demons being tied to individual people in the conversion program, just to actually inflict suffering so people will not act or even try to not think about their sexuality. And there's the conversation that Rose has with Saul, and I think that's the key of it. Is like, when she says like, but I'm still gay and you're still gay. We're just like frightened into and forced to not live it out. But you can't change who we are. You can't change what people are, who people are. You can only force them by brutal violence to, deny those things to themselves, and that just leads to suffering. It is external force in this case. It's demons, but it's demons made to do these things by humans. And I think that's another part that I think is really powerful, which is the ending when all the demons are freed, and it becomes very clear that demons may be terrible beings, because, you know, they're transdimensional, whatever, it doesn't really matter that much. Demons are not the problem. They might like to torture people for a very weird sense of justice, but while this justice might be extremely harsh, at the end of the day, it's still that they punish, well, the people that kind of deserve the punishment, because they reinforced, well, that system of torture to keep people from being themselves. And I think that's another part that I feel is important, because while it does have a supernatural component, and it's kind of difficult to make that kind of story with a supernatural component, and at the same time keep the message that the people, or in our world, enforcing these systems of oppression, torturing people, being an actual threat to queer people, that's still humans. They may use all kinds of tools, but that's a human idea. It's not coming from anywhere else, and that I think makes the book work in a way that it just straight up being demons would not have worked. I think even if, you know, the church and the demons would have agreed on the fact that, you know, queerness is a sin, it would not have worked. It's important that this is a human thing, and at the end of the day, the tools are, well, still suffering, even though they are very problematic because they're demons in a way. So I think that makes so much, that makes this book so much better than it could have been, and I really, really appreciate that. Another part that I think is important is the way that actual sexuality, or not even sexuality, is portrayed, because this does the way that the slowly rediscovery of Rose's queerness is portrayed throughout the book is incredibly heartwarming to me. The way she does not fully understand it, because, well, her mind, you know, brainwashing is covering it up. All of that felt extremely well, heartwarming to me in a way. The tenderness towards the characters in this regard, I think, is the important part that I'm trying to explain here, or express here. Is like, all of this is, people are incredibly kind to themselves, and Chuck Tingle as an author is incredibly kind to his characters in that regard. The way that, you know, Willow and Rose are slowly trying to reconnect and rebuild their relationship after the traumatic events that have happened, the way they don't just, like you might see in very different kind of books or horror movies, just go back to snap normal. It's like, no, you can't go back to normal after a trauma like that. You can't, but you have to slowly reconnect. I think that's a very powerful message, a very well-delivered message that I really loved about it. As I did of the parts where Rose is slowly regaining her memories of the relationship. And it's also very clear that, no, it's not a perfect relationship, because humans argue, humans fight, humans are complicated. When we have relationships, they're not just the beautiful things we see in the movies. There's all the other stuff as well. But if you trust a person, that's just part of it, because you can actually have the ugly parts as well, because you can trust yourself. There's a layer of trust here, and the focus on trust over just, you know, sexual attraction or whatever you want to have, however you want to call it. The fact that trust is the thing that is put front and center here, I think, is a very, very powerful thing as well. That leaves us with the autism representation. Now, I have not been diagnosed with autism, so I have no idea about that. I just felt the way it was integrated to me felt really natural, in a way that I feel gave me insight into how someone on the spectrum might feel and act. I found that really, really helpful, in a way that I found, as someone who is, you know, not an expert on disability or neurodiversity representation in general, I found that very enlightening in a way, and I really appreciated that, because it was just like, it's just part of her. It never gets like explicitly mentioned until like halfway through the book. It's like, yep, she's just got these kind of tics, and she thinks about things in that very specific way, and that's just like who Rose is. And I think that was a very, very, very well done aspect of the book that I really, really appreciated. I think that's most of the individual aspects that I personally really appreciated about Camp Damascus. So let's tie this all together and wrap it all up. I think Camp Damascus works incredibly well, and is probably one of the best and most important books released this year, because it does capture, in a way, the feelings of a community that is under a very real threat at the moment. It captures those and uses the language of a generation and a genre that works, which is the teenage horror, put full of pop culture references. It uses these, it uses a language that fits with that, and it empowers the group, the target audience. It empowers people who are different. It tells them that, yes, you can fight those demons if you use the things you have, if you use your specific strengths, and if you believe in yourself, and if you believe in others that are unique, and if you take everyone as the person who they are, as the unique person who they are, you can stand up to systems. And sometimes that may involve burning it all down, which, yeah, because some things need to be burned down, some things need to be overcome in that way. And that's a powerful message, and it's one that I personally 100% agree with and support, and I think that makes this a book that has the potential to just speak to a lot of people because of all the things it does, and has a positive, empowering message that I think we all need at the moment, because it's so exhausting to deal with all that threat all the time. And it's just nice to have a story like that reach the mainstream. In a way, it's something that you might see in a lot of fan fiction, I feel, but actually seeing it published by a major publisher, I think is heartening. It's a positive thing. I think it kind of shows that we're on the right track, because while the threats against queer people are extremely brutal at the moment, the fact that major publishers are willing to publish this kind of empowering story should give us hope and tell us that we're on the right track. And yeah, maybe love will actually win. I think it's great to have a book like this, even if it only gives hope for a moment and makes us smile and makes us go, well, we should go and do this. And that's something I really appreciated. Anyway, these are my thoughts on why Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle is such an important book right now, and I love it. And yeah, I hope you love the book as well. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like, subscribe, do the things. Should you feel like, I don't know, being able to spare me $1 or $2, I'm out of cash until the end of the month, so I don't know, maybe help you out. Anyway, I didn't want to beg for money. I'm just, really happy that the first book this year I was looking forward to was actually really, really good. And I hope you think so too. And I'll see you in the next one. And until then, thanks and cheers.